Well, hey, this is James Riley.
And Beth Riley.
And a really cool edition of our Artist Spotlight podcast series today. Beth, who we have?
Well, today we have author Joel Selvin, author of the book Hollywood Eden.
How you doing?
Good. Good to be with you guys.
Man, great to have you here. And this is really just such a fantastic book. I grew up in Kentucky, knew nothing about beaches and the California lifestyle.
No ocean, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I knew from it was the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean. So this really hit home for me, just kind of discovering this. And the book sort of bookends Jan and Dean singing in the showers in high school, late 50s through Good Vibrations, late 66, only about an 8-year period, but so much happened during this time.
I think it's a straight through line from singing in the showers at University High after football practice to Brian making Good Vibrations, arguably the greatest pop record ever made. So, yes, there's quite a few miles between those two endpoints.
And the book is Hollywood Eden. How did you come up with that title?
I don't know. I was looking for a kind of like 50s-ish potboiler title, and, just playing with different concepts. It fits the thing perfectly. It is the beginnings of the whole West Coast pop scene, from its like seed status to its total fruition. And as with the original Eden, things didn't turn out all that well.
I was always interested to hear Dion on the East Coast talk about being influenced by Hank Williams and other blues artists, but it came out sounding differently through the streets of New York. And then thinking of, when I hear Mike Love or Dean Torrence talk about the influence of doo-wop, how maybe even the music of Dion filtering through the West Coast California scene, it certainly came out differently too.
Yeah, it was that stuff too. It wasn't the rockabilly or the blues stuff. It was that New York vocal group sound that really resonated with the 50s LA kids. And they were hearing it on the radio from disc jockeys who were broadcasting for an African-American audience. You can't be responsible for who tunes into your show. And so Hunter Hancock and Art LeBeau and Huggy Boy, who were playing that stuff in the late 40s and early 50s on the radio, came to be a fascination with Los Angeles area white youth that lived up in the hills. And you see it in all the West Coast music to all through the Beach Boys, shot through with that whole sort of doo-wop influence. And one of my favorites of the Los Angeles bands that vamped on doo-wop is Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. They were, probably the last great American rock band to actually perform doo-wop. It was always a part of what Zappa was doing. So yeah, for some reason, that was the kernel in L.A.
And you talk about a cast of different characters in the book from 3 different schools. Tell us a little bit about the different characters in that book, like Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys.
So a lot of this book sort of ignited for me when somebody showed me a University High yearbook from 1958, and I found that Jan and Dean and Nancy Sinatra and Bruce Johnston and Kim Fowley, the record producer, and Sandy Nelson, the drummer, and even the girl known as Gidget, Kathy Kohner, all went to school together and all knew each other. And that just fascinated me. University High is on the far west side of Los Angeles. It served public high school serving the very wealthy, privileged neighborhoods of Brentwood and Bel Air. A lot of show business kids and parents who were actors and actresses or studio employees or attorneys, accountants, prop shop, what have you. So it had a very elite culture. It was 10 minutes from the beach. The kids drove themselves to school in their own cars, and they lived a life in that class, that 1955 to 58 class, which was the real original rock and roll class. It was just idyllic in many respects. It was California before jet travel. It was Los Angeles before freeways and smog and crowds. It was, little villages scattered across 500 square miles, all connected by these big boulevards. Los Angeles being the only major city, I think, in the world that was mostly developed after the invention of the automobile. And then, as you mentioned, there were other people the same age that were involved in this music too, but, like Fairfax High, it's more central Hollywood, more Jewish, more diverse, we would say now. But that's where Phil Spector went to school. That's where Steve Douglas, the saxophone player, had a band, and Phil played in that band. That's where Larry Knechtel, the session musician who played the bass on Mr. Tambourine Man, among many, many, many other things. He was in that high school. Herb Alpert earlier had been at Fairfax. There were different cultures in Los Angeles that were meeting up as they were unified with this common ground of rock and roll. That was just blowing up in their life, in their moment, in their day-to-day lives.
So this book isn't just about a boys' club. You had mentioned the name Nancy Sinatra earlier, and you also mentioned Joel Gibson and other in the book as well.
Oh, it's so important for me to include the female story. This is not untrammeled ground. There's, dozens of books on the Beach Boys, but they all seem to paint a picture of a boys' club. And, I was sure that women were there. I sought out Joel Gibson, in fact, when I was first considering the book. And when she agreed to help me and participate, that was kind of the linchpin that made me want to go forward with it, because I knew that I could then at least be assured of having this one prominent female. Women did not have wide social roles in that generation, and it was the struggle of women of that generation to establish some kind of independent identity and some kind of social role beyond being someone's girlfriend or wife. And that was the issue for women of that generation all across the country, but these were California girls, and that's a different thing. That's a different new culture. And Jill Gibson was a perfect example of that. She was Jan Berry's girlfriend, but she had her own job, she had her own money, she had her own Corvette. And she found her life still too abundantly restricted and was victimized and exploited. But, she never really devoted herself with the same degree. It was a very interesting story of how a woman could navigate those waters. And Nancy Sinatra, I wanted these stories out of the background, in the foreground. Nancy Sinatra not only had to deal with what all other women dealt with in that time, but she had to be Frank Sinatra's daughter. And that was kind of infantilizing for her. And, since she decided to pursue a career in show business, she was given just the most restrictive, stupid roles possible. And she chafed under that kind of restraint. But what was her option? Well, her option, she got married, and that didn't work out. Would follow her struggles to establish some kind of sense of self and independence. And it comes to a fruition at These Boots Are Made for Walking, which is not only probably the most radical type of self-assertion that a female had ever been allowed in a pop song before then, but it also mirrored the whole emergence of Nancy Sinatra as a person on her own, not somebody's girlfriend, not somebody's daughter, but herself. And I don't know why somebody as famous as Nancy Sinatra and a record that has had so much impact as that Boots record is missing from the previous accounts of rock and roll history. I can only assume that's because rock and roll history has largely been written by males, because Nancy Sinatra is a major figure in that period.
Oh, absolutely. We're friends with Bruce Johnston, and it's interesting, a lot of people maybe only know him from the Beach Boys, but really he played such a key figure in his early solo recordings, the stuff with Bruce and Terry, all the production stuff, and of course all the time in the Beach Boys. But you really touch on a lot of stuff with Bruce, and I was happy to see that.
Bruce is a key figure. I mean, he was up there in the Loma Linda garage with Jan Berry before Jan had a record out and they were making music. So he was right at the very beginning, right at the seed moment of the whole Los Angeles rock and roll scene. He lived a couple blocks down the street from Jan. Jan's father was Howard Hughes' right-hand man, and they lived on the absolute peak of the Bel Air Hills in a beautiful, beautiful house. Bruce, his father, was the head of the Rexall drug chain, and he lived a couple blocks down the hill, but it was next door to Burt Lancaster, so it wasn't exactly the ghetto, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were very privileged, and all they wanted to do was make music and make rock and roll records. Bruce was couple years younger than those guys. But he was on all the records. He was on Sandy Nelson's records. He backed up Richie Valens at the El Monte Legion Stadium gigs. He was just part of the fabric of Los Angeles rock and roll right from the beginning. And he had surf hit before the Beach Boys did. His original Surfer Stomp single was kind of like an underground hit in the Los Angeles basin before the Beach Boys surfing record. The Bruce and Terry were very successful Beach Boy imitations and brought Terry Melcher out of his shell. And then, bingo, he joins the Beach Boys. His first session was California Girls. Yeah. What a place to walk in,
What a great starting point.
I can't believe that he is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
The Wrecking Crew is an important group to touch on. The amount of stuff that they've been on is just insane.
That group of musicians was what enabled all these visionaries to do this pioneering work. They were such a different world from session musicians anywhere else in the country. Instead of being like jazz musicians or former big band guys or R&B veterans that were like slumming to do these rock and roll sessions, these guys were the same age as the musicians, and they came to the studio wearing blue jeans and T-shirts, and they were ready to play rock and roll from the downbeat. So that was a very important distinction, and it allowed Jan Berry, Phil Spector, Brian Wilson, and so many other people to do these fresh, vital kind of records that were going to reshape how all pop music was. And it starts in 1962 when Phil Spector, who left Los Angeles as soon as he could to pursue his music career in New York, where the music business was. But he finds himself in Los Angeles in the need to put a session together in a hurry because he wants to record a song ahead of a competitor. So he calls his high school classmate, Steve Douglas, who was a couple years older, actually. Steve had been in Dwayne Eddy's band, and he'd retired from the road to play sessions around Los Angeles. He was just sort of starting out his career, playing a lot of section work on R&B records and stuff like that. And Spector says to put a band together. So he shows up at Gold Star, and there's this drummer, Hal Blaine. There's Al DeLory on piano. There's Tommy Tedesco on guitar. I mean, this is the beginnings of this group that, years and years and years later would be called the Wrecking Crew. They didn't have any idea they were a band at all until the 80s when Hal Blaine wrote his memoirs. They were just professionals that worked. And how many of them were in there? Could be, depending on who you include, 20, 30 guys that were sort of interchangeable in that era doing these sessions. And they played on everybody's records. They played on Sinatra records. They played on Merle Haggard records. They played on Glen Campbell records. Glen Campbell was somebody who came out of that group of musicians. He came to California in 1962, broke as nothing, and made $100,000 the first year as a session player.
I mean, one of the things you touch on in here too, Jan Berry, just so creative in so many ways. But one of my favorite early stories of him is just making up the K-Jan station. I remember Dean telling me that they used to throw, the cast off the records they didn't like, as frisbees off of the hillside there. But just how funny that is, and but just also showed the kind of creativity and the ends that he would go to.
He wasn't a good kid, Yeah. A scam like the K-Jan fictional radio station so he could get free records was right up his alley. He was a shoplifter. He was a car racer on city streets. He was, something of a prankster. He got in fights, got arrested for pulling his pants down at the beach once. Yeah, he was never went to class and got A's and B's. He was an extraordinary kid, but he wasn't a good boy. Veered toward what they called juvenile delinquent.
Yeah, but I didn't realize this till looking in the book. Jan and Arnie, when they were doing some shows early on, did some stuff with Link Ray. In my mind, I was thinking it was probably something like the Monkees when they took Jimi Hendrix out with them or something. Jan and Arnie and Link Ray, just such a interesting combo, but of course, a lot of combo packages like that at the time.
Link was an amazing character. He didn't have shoes until he was 10 years old, was just the most extraordinary sort of primitive artist you can imagine. That fuzz tone was created by punching holes in his amplifier speaker cone with a pencil point. That's how advanced the technology was. Yeah, Link Ray is like, the real Johnny Be Good.
So going back to Jan and Dean together, They were both big fans of Laurel and Hardy, and they did some of those hijinks, not only on stage, but also in public, like staging fistfights.
There was a character named Randy that Jan would adopt in restaurants. And Randy was what was called a mental retard. We call them disabled people now. And he would slur his food, and sometimes he would have spastic attacks on the floor. And this was all just sort of, some big gag that these guys like to pull in public. And, the girlfriends were all used to us, like, oh my gosh, not this again. But yeah, they all knew, everybody knew Randy.
So the first time Jan and Dean, the Beach Boys meet, Beach Boys were backing Jan and Dean up on the show. It's just, wow, I would have loved to have seen that.
Isn't that epic, meeting in a school classroom at Hermosa Beach Junior High, preparing for a Valentine's Day sock hop, and the Beach Boys, 2 records into their career, one of which had actually hit the national charts, and they're still playing sock hops in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And here Jan and Dean had heard of these guys and recognized the influence they'd had on the Beach Boys from Surfin', the first record, which is practically a rewrite of Baby Talk, the 1959 Jan and Dean hit. So it was kind of an epic, mythic meeting. And it was the flashpoint where Jan and Dean realized surf music was for them, and they talked Brian into having the Beach Boys back them up on a couple of album tracks, and they started thinking about writing songs together, and Brian had this line, 2 girls for every boy, and Jan caused a song to be written around that opening line, and then he brought Brian into the studio with him, and Brian played and sang on their record of it, learned how to stack harmony vocal overdubs, and worked with session musicians. And, Jan very much mentored Brian in his early days, because at that point, Brian was like 2 or 3 singles into his career, and Jan made a couple dozen records. So he was very much the veteran. And Brian was involved in Jan and Dean records, from then on out. He was co-writer and singer and played on the sessions all the way up to Ride the Wild Surf.
Yeah, but there's some great collaborations with those guys.
They were quite the partners. I mean, the Jan and Dean masterpiece, the song that would define Jan Berry's life, Dead Man's Curve, Brian started with another co-writer planning to bring Jan into finishing the song. So, I mean, that song Brian knew was for Jan Berry.
I didn't realize it was the Beach Boys backing up Jan and Dean when Jan and Dean covered the Beach Boys, Surfin' and Surfin' Safari.
Yeah, it's on their Jan and Dean Take Linda surfing album. The album was in production and near completion when they met the Beach Boys and got this flash that surfing music was going to be now. And their producer, Lou Adler, producer and manager, decided to tack it into the album title and make it a concept album. I think there's even pictures of surfboards on the cover.
Now, you can't talk about surf without talking about Dick Dale. What we didn't realize until reading the book was that he was an Elvis impersonator. And actually, Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys called him a greaser.
I co-produced Dick's 1994 comeback album, Tribal Thunder, and he hadn't been in the studio for 25, 30 years at that point, and that record went on to become like a gold record, and as I always like to say, took the cork out of the bottle, and out came Dick Dale. He'd never played outside of the Southern California counties before then. I'm, from my Southern California days, very well aware of the extraordinary influence that Dick Dale had on the rock and roll scene down there. He sat down at venues for years. The Harmony Park was just the first, in Huntington Beach, and that was where the surf music was kind of invented. But then he went on to the Aragon Ballroom in Santa Monica, and he was there for a couple years, and then he was at the Riverside National Guard Armory every weekend. So thousands and thousands of area teens, that was the first rock and roll. They saw Sammy Hagar was a regular at the Riverside National Guard Armory.
The term surf music, did it come from all these people coming in there and kind of dragging sand from the beaches in there from their shoes or something?
It was right on the beach where he was playing. It had been built in the 40s for the swing bands. But yeah, it was literally they'd surf all day and then just walk in barefoot, and there'd be sand on the floor from, it'd fallen out of people's pants. Dick always says that, that he developed this guitar style that emulated the sound of waves because he did the staccato runs on the bass strings and, that kind of stuff. Yeah, okay, sure. Ms. or Lou was the Greek national anthem. It wasn't exactly like an unknown melody. And then also, he was like the front end of the Fender guitar factory laboratory. Leo Fender would come and watch Dick and then go back to the factory and twiddle with his gear. And Dick played the absolute prototype, not 001, but the prototype of the Fender Stratocaster and the Fender Showman amplifier. In fact, Leo named it the Showman, thinking of Dick, that Dick was this great showman and he needed a Showman amplifier.
It's interesting, again, coming from Kentucky, and the only thing I knew of California was the Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, Dick Dale, and some others. Not just surfing, but also the whole hot rod car theme, and these went hand in hand over there.
They were drawing this from their own lives. I mean, Jan and Dean knew people that had Woodies with no rear windows. Jan routinely raced cars on city streets in Los Angeles. Cars were a big part of their lives. In Los Angeles, like I said, teenagers had their own cars, and you couldn't walk anywhere. You had to drive, and the city was made for it. So all this was their own lives, but somehow the records that they made that drew from this had a emblematic aspect to them that, like people in Kentucky related to. I mean, you didn't have ocean.
No.
And cars weren't like the same part of the culture, but the ocean and the metaphor of surfing is still, influential, still hits you. It's an organic thing. And the cars are the same thing. They represent self-empowerment. They represent liberation. They represent independence. And they also are cars. And the target audience of these records were people who were actually interested in cars. It's like, I know Jeff Berry, who was a big deal pop songwriter in the 60s, wrote his first hit song called Tell Laura I Love Her. And he wrote it about cowboys and Indians. And the music publisher said, teenagers don't care about horses. They like cars. He retooled it to be about a car crash and had a big hit record, lesson, teenagers like cars.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this was like a common ground for the target audience all over the country and indeed all over the world. Keith Moon of The Who was a huge surf music fan. I don't know where that comes from. He loved the car songs.
So our buddy Bruce Johnston, Hal Blaine, and others would make different albums with different band names, with different labels. The Custom Kings for Mercury, the Vets for MGM, the Catalinas. Just a different time for the record industry trying to capitalize on a sound.
Oh, they were making so many of those records at so many different studios. They didn't even know who they were when they were them. And, Steve Douglas told me he didn't think there was a car song in Los Angeles in 1964 that he didn't play on.
That's amazing. I think about the Beach Boys, I Get Around, just such a leap forward in production, and Brian really coming into his own, and of course standing up to his dad, Murray, firing him, during that session. A real pivotal point. I mean, and the song still holds up today.
You're so right. I remember that as a new record on the radio, and it was just such a leap forward. And it was an announcement that the Beach Boys were way more than surf music, and that they were, serious contenders for Top of the Pops. And the song just hit you like a slap in the face because it was so different than anything else that you'd ever heard from the Beach Boys or from anyone else at the time. So yeah, you're right. There was a lot of evolution and growth going on. And Brian really, had a remarkable ability to absorb his experience and advance his vision. And you can see that through the period of time from like 62 to 66, when he, makes Good Vibrations. And it's just a very short period of time to go as far as he went.
There's a great playlist at the very end of the book, including the songs that you reference, and it's impressive to think of all these during the stretch of the time from the late 50s through Good Vibrations.
Playlist is mirrored on Spotify. You can dial it up yourself. It is an extraordinary experience to listen to. It's about 3.5 hours long, and where it starts is a very primitive, innocent, naive place. And you can feel the experiences mounting up and the lessons being learned and the advancements being made as you go through this playlist. The journey is one from complete innocence, Eden. I mean, everybody starts out naked in this book, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It's a journey from complete innocence to some considerable self-knowledge. And it ends, people say, rather abruptly. But the fact is that, that's where I did not want to prolong decay and disintegration of these lives. I left them really pretty much at the point where they, could just step off.
It's pretty remarkable to think all of this in 8 years. I mean, people can argue, or is there a more important 8-year stretch, and other could be, and people talk about it, but this has been really important time period, and the effect and influence that it had all over the world. Of course, the Beatles influenced by the Beach Boys and vice versa and stuff. But yeah, this is a pretty remarkable 8-year period.
Well, so much was going on in world history and in the culture of that generation, and it was a remarkable 8-year period for everyone. But that, of course, was the origin story, and starts from something very small and grows into something very large, and it did so, as you suggest, rather quickly.
Yeah. So in your opinion, of course, we talk a lot about Jan and Dean. Do you think they'll ever make it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
They certainly deserve to be there if you treat the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with any seriousness. Their contributions are manifest and manifold, but the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, not to get too tangential about it, has an extremely severe East Coast bias, and that's reflected in all the inductions. I was a member of the nominating committee for a little while, and I assure you, it was openly that way. People were derisive of West Coast bands in the nominating committee.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, we talked about Link Wray and Dick Dale. Both of them deserve to be in there as well.
Well, Link Wray's not really a West Coast
No.
But no. I think the Doobie Brothers just got in. I mean, what? The Doobie Brothers had to get in behind Cheap Trick.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because the Cheap Trick had much more influence on the East Coast than the Doobie Brothers did. That's a California band. California is a unique culture. And that's part of the whole sort of thematic material in Hollywood Eden, is that California was so remote from the rest of the country at the time, and it had developed this rather remarkable culture of its own. And all this stuff that came out of the culture at that time was kind of unspoiled by its association with the more established and institutionalized world of the East Coast, of New York and Philadelphia and like that. Things were fresh, things were open. There was no aristocracy. It was a really fast and loose society. And as I say in the book, it was Hollywood when things were still possible.
So one thing I like to do is to bring up something completely unrelated to the topic we're discussing. At the end of this book would be the beginning of two of my favorites, Jackson Browne and James Taylor. You a fan of either one?
Sure. The whole subsequent school of Los Angeles pop, which was built on these shoulders, Mamas and Papas, Byrds, Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, Johnny Rivers, too.
Sure.
Thing that happened up in Laurel Canyon and on the Sunset Strip. I mean, I'm not unaware of the importance of the Doors and Buffalo Springfield and all that came after that, but I'm not fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by early Hollywood before the smog and before the freeways, and before the industry built up around it to sort of start contriving a lot of this stuff and changing the values. Because, the people in this book, they're not really trying to crack the charts in some kind of venal ambition. They're really zealots on a mission. They just are on this rock and roll program, and that's what matters to them. After the thing peaks at good vibrations, the industry becomes so self-conscious and so aware of things. It's much less interesting to me. There's some great records out of that era and that group of artists, and there were some really wonderful talents involved, but it just doesn't have the romantic allure that I find like in these pioneers who were dealing with things that had never been dealt with before. Charging into virgin territory. Each new record was a whole new expansion of the idiom and experiments that fail or succeed. And that ultimately in the book, the experiment that fails is River Deep Mountain High by Phil Spector, and then it's followed by the experiment that succeeds. Good vibrations.
Yeah.
Well, it is a great book, and we enjoyed every page of it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Speaking of the book, where is the best place for people to find out about this book and some of your other books as well?
So there is a joelselvin.com, and it's loaded with podcasts. You can, if you have time to waste, you can catch me talking with Tom Waits and Donovan and Booker T, and I have a bunch of other variety of programs up there, and all the information about my books and whatever is there. And the best place to buy the book, of course, would be an independent local bookstore that's been struggling for the last year and a change to keep their doors open and keep their employees fed. So, but then barring that, there is always Amazon.
Sure, absolutely. It's Hollywood Eden, Joel Selvin. Thanks so much for spending the time. We could talk for hours about this stuff. And
Dane, Beth, it's just a pleasure. I'm glad to be here with you. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.